On the night of August 4th, 1962, the lights were still on inside a modest house on 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood, California. The Santa Ana winds were blowing warm through the canyons. Los Angeles was asleep. By morning, Marilyn Monroe would be gone, and the entire world would know. But somewhere in that house were 2 sealed boxes that no one would open for nearly 50 years. What was inside would shatter everything the world thought it knew about her. Inside those boxes were poems, haunting, raw, and achingly intelligent, written in her own hand on hotel stationery and dog-eared notebooks. Not the words of a woman performing for the camera. The words of a woman wrestling with loneliness, mortality, and a brilliant mind the world refused to see. In a poem called Life, Pesci wrote, "I am strong as a cobweb in the wind, surviving the cold, glistening frost, transparent and weightless, but still here." Those words weren't written by the Marilyn Monroe the world thought they knew, and what was found in those boxes goes far deeper than anyone expected. The boxes that stayed closed for 50 years. August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe passed away alone in her Brentwood home. She was 36 years old. As the cameras flashed and headlines screamed, very few people knew what would happen to her most private possessions. Notebooks and diaries where she'd wrestled with one devastating question: do I matter beyond what you can see? Her will specified that everything would go to Lee Strasberg, her acting coach at the Actors Studio in New York. He took her belongings, including 2 sealed boxes, and stored them in a warehouse on the east side of Manhattan. He never spoke publicly about what was inside, not once in 20 years. The boxes sat in darkness while the legend of Marilyn Monroe grew larger and more distorted with every passing year. But here's what was hiding inside. Marilyn had copied out a quote revealing her secret intellectual life. What the world really needs is a real feeling of kinship. Everybody, stars, laborers, Negroes, Jews, Arabs, we are all brothers. The woman the world dismissed as just a pretty face, a woman who never finished high school, who grew up in foster homes and orphanages, was quoting political philosophy. In 1982, Lee Strasberg passed away. His widow, Anna, began cataloging his estate. She sorted through decades of theater memorabilia, scripts, and correspondence, and then she came to 2 boxes she'd never seen before. That's when everything changed. Inside were Italian-made diaries engraved in green leather, spiral notebooks labeled record and red livewire, scraps of hotel stationery from the Waldorf Astoria and Parkside House, loose pages torn from legal pads, cocktail napkins with ink smudged at the edges. And covering every surface in Marilyn's distinctive handwriting, looping, urgent, sometimes barely legible, were poems, fragments, confessions, philosophical meditations. The private interior landscape of a woman the world thought it knew completely. In one fragment, Marilyn had written, "Only parts of us will ever touch parts of others, so one is, for most part, alone." Anna realized immediately the image of the empty-headed starlet was a performance, a mask so convincing that even 2 decades after Marilyn's passing, people still believed it was real. Working with editors Bernard Comment and Stanley Buchthal, Anna decided the world needed to see what had been hidden. In 2010, nearly 50 years after Marilyn's passing, the writings were published in a volume titled Fragments. The title was perfect, because Marilyn herself had been fragmented, split between the image Hollywood created and the woman she actually was. But to understand what those fragments really mean, to understand the depth of what Marilyn was writing about, you have to go back to the beginning, back to a childhood that explains why a woman surrounded by millions of admirers could feel so profoundly alone. A childhood built on disappearance. Norma Jean Mortensen was born on June 1st, 1926 in the charity ward of Los Angeles General Hospital. Her mother, Gladys, was a film cutter at RKO Studios, a woman who worked in the dream factory but whose own life was coming apart. Within 2 weeks of giving birth, Gladys placed her daughter with a foster family. She couldn't care for the child. She could barely care for herself. What followed was a childhood defined by impermanence. Norma Jean moved between foster homes and orphanages. She was never in one place long enough to feel safe. Families took her in and then gave her back as if she were something borrowed rather than someone who belonged. In some homes, she was treated kindly. In others, she was put to work, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, earning her keep like a boarder rather than a child. By the time she was 16, she had lived in 11 different homes, 11 front doors, 11 sets of strangers deciding whether she was worth keeping. In one of her notebook entries written decades later, Marilyn described a memory from those years. She recalled standing at a window watching a family eat dinner together in the house across the street. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't cold. But she remembered the feeling of watching connection happen on the other side of glass, close enough to see, too far away to touch. That image, connection visible but unreachable, would haunt everything she ever wrote. At 11, she was placed in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home on El Centro Avenue. The building was large and institutional. There were rules about when to eat, when to sleep. She later told interviewers that the worst part wasn't the loneliness or the regimented days. It was being told she wasn't an orphan. Her mother was alive. Her mother was in a psychiatric hospital across town. Her mother simply didn't want her, or couldn't want her. The distinction didn't matter to a child. The result was the same. She was alone not because her parents had died, but because she had been set aside, deliberately, repeatedly, by the one person who was supposed to keep her. This is the woman who would later write about cobwebs surviving the frost. This is the woman who would stand on the Brooklyn Bridge and find beauty in a world that had given her every reason to look away. But before any of that, she had to become Marilyn Monroe. And to understand her writing, you have to understand what that transformation cost her. She married at 16 to escape the foster system. The marriage didn't last. She was discovered by a photographer while working in a munitions factory during the war, then signed by a studio, then handed a new name, a new hair color, a new voice, and a new identity. Norma Jean became Marilyn Monroe. The studio told her what to wear, how to speak, how to walk, how to laugh, how to tilt her head when a camera was pointed at her. They built Marilyn Monroe from the outside in, a character designed to be desired, not understood, a product engineered for maximum appeal and minimum complexity. The real woman, the one who remembered standing at that window, watching a family she didn't belong to. She disappeared inside the performance. She was still there, but no one was looking for her anymore. They were looking at Marilyn, and Marilyn was a mask that fit so perfectly, the world forgot there was a face underneath. But the real woman never stopped trying to claw her way out. The first place she looked for herself was in books. The 400 books. No one talked about Marilyn Monroe's personal library contained approximately 400 volumes. Not romance novels, not movie magazines. Her shelves held Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, James Joyce's Ulysses, one of the most challenging novels in the English language, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Tolstoy, and Hemingway. She'd never finished high school, a fact that haunted her throughout her life. So she educated herself with a kind of ferocity that the people around her found bewildering. She enrolled in night classes at UCLA, studying literature and United States history. She took notes in the margins of her textbooks. She underlined passages in her novels and wrote responses, engaging in silent conversations with authors who had been gone for centuries. And then she did something her studio publicists begged her not to do. She insisted on being photographed while reading. The publicists were furious. They'd spent years crafting an image of Marilyn as approachable, uncomplicated, non-threatening, a fantasy who required nothing from her admirers except their desire. A beautiful woman who didn't intimidate men with her intelligence. A product designed for consumption, not conversation. But Marilyn kept showing up to photo shoots with serious intellectual books tucked under her arm. The photographs hit newsstands. Critics pounced. She's pretending, they said. It's all for show. She probably can't even understand those books. The idea that Marilyn Monroe could genuinely love literature was treated as absurd, even laughable. But the people who actually spent time with her told a very different story. Carl Sandburg, the legendary poet, Lincoln biographer, and multiple Pulitzer Prize winner, met Marilyn in the 1950s. He was in his 70s by then, a towering figure in American letters. He was exactly the kind of intellectual who might have dismissed a Hollywood starlet as frivolous. Instead, he conducted informal literary tutorials with her. They sat together and discussed poetry, history, and the American character. Sandburg read to her, she read to him, and when asked about her later, Sandburg said simply that Marilyn was a good talker. From a man who valued language and thought above all else, that wasn't a throwaway compliment. It was extraordinary praise. It meant she could hold a conversation with one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century, and he found her worth listening to. Marilyn particularly identified with Grushenka, a character from the Brothers Karamazov. Grushenka is a woman scorned by society, viewed as immoral and unworthy, a temptress, a fallen woman, someone dismissed by respectable people as beneath their notice. But beneath that surface, Grushenka possesses a depth and resilience that the other characters fail to recognize until it's too late. She is generous where they expected selfishness. She is wise where they expected foolishness. She carries wounds they never bothered to notice. Marilyn didn't just read about Grushenka. She saw herself in her. She told friends that she understood what it meant to be judged by everyone who looked at you and known by no one. She understood what it felt like to have your surface story be so loud that your real story became inaudible. The 400 books weren't props. They were proof that Marilyn had been fighting all along to be seen as something more than a body. In a world that saw her as an object, books were the only place she could be a subject, a thinking, feeling, autonomous person engaging with ideas that mattered. But reading other people's words about loneliness wasn't the same as speaking her own truth. So she stopped merely reading and started writing. And this is where the story takes a turn that no one saw coming. Strong as a cobweb in the wind. A cobweb is almost nothing, transparent, weightless, so delicate that a single careless gesture can destroy it, and yet cobwebs survive. They endure frost, rain, and wind. They bend without breaking. They catch the light and reveal hidden beauty. That's how Marilyn saw herself, not as powerful or invincible, but as something that survived despite or perhaps because of its fragility. The girl who had been passed from home to home, the woman who had been molded into someone else's fantasy, she was still here, battered, translucent, but intact. She had survived things that should have broken her. An unstable childhood in foster care, a mother who couldn't keep her, early marriages that offered escape but not love, the grinding machinery of the studio system, which treated contract players like interchangeable parts, the constant, relentless expectation that she would eventually crack under the pressure. And yet she hadn't. Not yet. But there's a darkness woven into the metaphor. Cobwebs don't last forever. Frost melts them. Wind tears them apart. A careless hand sweeps them away without even noticing they were there. Marilyn knew she was living on borrowed time. The poem isn't triumphant. It's an elegy written in advance by someone who could already feel herself beginning to disappear. And what she wrote next reveals something even more devastating. Because what terrified Marilyn more than breaking was this: being surrounded by millions of admirers and still feeling completely, utterly alone. Only parts of us will ever touch parts of others. Marilyn explored what scholars would later call ontological loneliness, the belief that true connection between human beings is structurally impossible. She wrote, "Only parts of us will ever touch parts of others." And from that, she drew a devastating conclusion. So one is for most part alone. This wasn't self-pity, it was philosophy, articulated with a clarity that would have stunned anyone who thought Marilyn incapable of abstract thought. Think about what that sentence means. Marilyn was saying that even in our closest relationships, even in love, even in marriage, even in the most intimate moments two people can share, we only ever access fragments of each other. We show parts, we hide parts, we misunderstand parts. On magazine covers around the world, she was one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, and yet she believed that genuine connection was impossible, not because she hadn't tried, but because she had tried desperately, repeatedly, and failed every time. Because the people who loved Marilyn Monroe didn't actually love her. They loved the performance, the breathless blonde who seemed perpetually delighted by the world, but the real Marilyn, the one reading Dostoevsky at 2 a.m, writing about cobwebs and loneliness in a spiral notebook, that Marilyn was invisible. Even her husbands couldn't reach her. Joe DiMaggio wanted to protect her, but he wanted to protect the image, not the complicated woman behind it. He wanted the girl in the white dress, not the woman with 400 books and a diary full of philosophical questions he couldn't answer. Arthur Miller, the great playwright, seemed different at first. He gave her books. They discussed literature. He appeared to appreciate her intelligence in ways DiMaggio never had. For a time, Marilyn believed she'd found someone who could finally see past the image. Then she caught him. In one diary entry from 1960, she wrote about discovering Miller observing her clinically during her most vulnerable moments, taking mental notes on her pain as if she were a character he was studying for his next play, rather than a wife he was supposed to love. She found notes he'd written about her instability, about her emotional volatility. He was cataloging her suffering the way a scientist catalogs specimens. She was data to him, material, content. In another entry, From shortly after their wedding, she described the sickening realization that even on her wedding night, she could feel the playwright in him watching, processing, filing things away. The husband and the writer were never separate, and the writer always won. Even the man who claimed to see her depth still saw her primarily as raw content for his art, a troubled muse rather than a fully autonomous person. The realization devastated her. She had opened herself completely to someone for the first time, and discovered that even total vulnerability wasn't enough to create real connection. He was still on the other side of the glass, watching her the way she'd once watched that family eating dinner as a child. Being surrounded by people made the loneliness worse. Every interaction reminded her of the gap between who she was and who people thought she was. Every admirer proved that she could be seen by millions and still remain utterly invisible. She didn't write these poems to be read. She wrote them because writing was the only honest conversation she could have. The page didn't want anything from her. It didn't need her to be beautiful or charming or provocative. It didn't require a performance. The page accepted her loneliness as real. The world never did. But Marilyn didn't just retreat into writing. She made a decision that shocked Hollywood, and it led her to the one place where her pain would become both her greatest weapon and her greatest danger. Stage? A sanctuary. At the absolute height of her fame, Marilyn Monroe walked away from Hollywood, not quietly, not temporarily. She left behind her contract, her studio, and the machinery that had made her a star. She packed her things and moved to New York City, 3,000 miles from the world that had created her, and enrolled as a student at the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg. Strasberg taught a technique called the method, an approach that demanded actors stop performing and start being. Instead of memorizing lines and hitting marks, method actors access genuine emotion from their own lives, digging into real traumas and channeling real pain into their work. The stage wasn't a place to pretend, it was a place to bleed. And Strasberg's classroom was where the bleeding began. The other students at the Actors Studio were skeptical when Marilyn walked in. They expected the movie star. They expected the breathy voice and the calculated charm. What they got instead was a woman who sat quietly in the back row, took notes, and listened with an intensity that unnerved some of them. When Strasberg finally asked her to perform an exercise, she stood in front of the class and did something no one expected. She told the truth, not the glamorous truth, not the Hollywood truth, the raw, unfiltered truth about what it felt like to be her. And the room went silent. For Marilyn, this was both liberation and torment. On stage, she wrote, "I won't be whipped for my emotions." Read that sentence again, "I won't be whipped for my emotions." It tells you everything about what she endured every other moment of her life. In her regular world, showing emotion made her a target. Studios saw emotional actresses as difficult. Directors saw them as unprofessional. The public saw them as unstable. Vulnerability wasn't just a liability, it was punished, sharply, immediately, every time. But on Strasberg's stage, the rules were reversed. Emotion was currency. Pain was power. The deeper you went, the more real the performance became. For the first time in Marilyn's life, the feelings she'd been told to suppress were treated as valuable, not as weakness, as art. She threw herself into her studies with an intensity that surprised even Strasberg. She showed up early, she stayed late, she worked on emotional exercises for hours, accessing memories and feelings that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid. But the technique that gave her permission to feel also required her to keep feeling. To keep reopening old wounds, the foster homes, the absent mother, the marriages that failed, the men who saw through her, but never truly saw her. All of it dredged up again and again in service of her craft. Her performances from this period are extraordinary, raw and honest in ways Hollywood rarely allowed, but the cost was immense. The emotions she accessed didn't stay confined to the stage. They followed her home. They haunted her nights. They made the loneliness worse because now she wasn't just lonely, she was intimately acquainted with all the reasons why. The stage was a sanctuary only if you could leave it behind when the performance ended. For Marilyn, the performance never ended, so she turned to the only people who seemed to see her as a mind rather than a body, writers and poets. And one conversation with a poet named Norman Rosten would produce the most heartbreaking moment in this entire story. If you're finding this story as compelling as we are, please consider liking and subscribing. We uncover the true stories behind Golden Age Hollywood's most iconic figures, the ones the studio system tried to bury. Is there poetry in there? Norman Rosten was a poet who lived in Brooklyn Heights, a quiet neighborhood of brownstones and tree-lined streets just across the East River from Manhattan. He was respected in literary circles, but not famous, the kind of writer who valued craft over celebrity. He became Marilyn's confidant, someone she trusted with her most vulnerable questions, someone who didn't want anything from her except honest conversation. Their friendship was unlike any other relationship in Marilyn's life. Rosten didn't care about her fame. He didn't need her to be beautiful or entertaining or on. He was interested in what she thought, what she felt, what she was trying to say, with words that didn't come easily to her. They would talk for hours about poetry, about loneliness, about the gap between who people thought you were and who you actually were. Sometimes they walked together along the Brooklyn Heights promenade, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, and Marilyn would ask him questions about poetry that revealed just how carefully she'd been reading. She wanted to understand not just what poems said, but how they worked, why certain combinations of words could make you feel something that no single word could accomplish alone. Marilyn would send him her poems. Fragments written late at night in hotel rooms, scrawled on whatever paper she could find. Lines composed on quiet afternoons in her apartment when the phone wasn't ringing and the world briefly forgot she existed. In 1959, she sent him a particularly raw piece. 3 days later, the phone rang. "Marilyn," Rosten said, "I've read it 7 times. She went quiet. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "Do you think there is poetry in there?" She wasn't asking if the poem scanned properly or if the metaphors worked. She was asking something far more fundamental. Do I contain something worthy of being called art? Does the woman everyone wants actually have a soul? Is there anything inside me that matters beyond what you can see? "There's more than poetry here," Rosten told her. "There's a poet," Marilyn cried. Not because she believed him, but because for one moment she desperately wanted to. The poems themselves answer the question. They're haunting and raw and achingly human. But Marilyn couldn't accept that her interior life had value when the entire world insisted her value lay solely in her exterior. She had been told, by studios, by publicists, by audiences, by critics, by husbands, that her worth was her surface. And no matter how many books she read or poems she wrote, that message had seeped so deep into her that even a poet's sincere praise couldn't dislodge it. The literati who knew her saw her brilliance, but the world didn't. The public continued to see the blonde, the body, the breathy voice. They saw the performance and assumed that was all there was. For Marilyn, who spent her entire life being seen but never truly known, that invisibility was unbearable. And then, in those same boxes, Anna Strasberg found one more fragment. It was about the Brooklyn Bridge, and what Marilyn confessed in it changes everything. The Brooklyn Bridge and the beauty that kept her alive. Marilyn admitted something profound and terrifying. She had contemplated taking her own life. She had stood at the edge and considered stepping off, but she could never do it from the Brooklyn Bridge. Why? Because, she wrote, "Everything is beautiful from there, and I've never seen an ugly bridge. Let that settle for a moment." Marilyn, who had survived a childhood of abandonment, foster care, an absent mother, failed marriages, studio exploitation, public humiliation, and unrelenting scrutiny from a world that watched her every move while refusing to see who she actually was. This woman was held to existence by one thing. Not love, though she searched for it desperately her entire life. Not fame, which brought her more pain than joy. Not success, which felt hollow when it came from playing a character she despised. She was held here by beauty, by the view from a bridge. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out to the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by calling or texting 988. You are not alone. Picture her standing there, the East River below, dark and restless, catching the late afternoon light in shards of silver and gold. Manhattan behind her, its skyline jagged and ambitious. Brooklyn ahead, lower and quieter, its brownstones lined up like sentences in a book. The cables of the bridge rising in their elegant arcs overhead, humming faintly in the wind. The wooden planks of the pedestrian walkway beneath her feet. The sound of traffic below muffled by distance into something almost musical. From up here, the city that had both celebrated and wounded her looked different. The chaos resolved into patterns. The noise faded into rhythm. The cruelty became abstract, something happening far below, to someone else in another world entirely. From this vantage point, New York wasn't the city that had chewed her up and sold her in pieces. It was a work of art, messy and imperfect, but beautiful in the way that only imperfect things can be. From the Brooklyn Bridge, life looked manageable, even lovely. And Marilyn, who had spent her whole life searching for beauty, in books, in poetry, in the faces of people she loved, in the act of performing, found enough of it in that single view to choose to stay. That capacity to find beauty, to see grace in a bridge, in a line of poetry, in the way light fell across a room, was what kept her alive, at least for a time. She chose life that day, but the fragment breaks off there, incomplete. Like so much of Marilyn's writing, sentences that trail into silence, thoughts that reach toward something and then stop, as if the hand holding the pen simply ran out of strength. It doesn't tell us what happened the next day, or the day after that, or all the days that followed until August 5th, 1962. Maybe the real Marilyn was the woman who saw an unbearable world and chose for as long as she could to find the beauty in it. Who stood on a bridge and decided that the view, just the simple act of seeing something lovely, was reason enough to turn around and go home. Who survived on aesthetics and poetry and the faint hope that someone, someday, might see her the way she saw that bridge, as something worth preserving, something that deserved to exist for its own sake, not for what it carried across, not for what it connected, but simply because it was beautiful. And beauty, even fragile, weathered, imperfect beauty, was reason enough to remain. Do I matter beyond what you can see? In 2010, those boxes were finally opened to the world. Nearly 50 years of silence. Nearly 50 years of the world believing it knew everything there was to know about Marilyn Monroe. And then the fragments, the poems, the philosophical meditations, the raw, unguarded voice of a woman who had been screaming into a void her entire life, and whose words had finally impossibly been heard. Inside, the world found a woman who'd asked the same question in 100 different ways. Do I matter beyond what you can see? Throughout those notebooks, she returned to questions of identity again and again. Who am I when I'm not performing? What parts of me are real? Can anyone ever truly know another person, or are we all fundamentally alone? She documented her perfectionism, her terror of disappointing people, her conviction that any mistake would prove what the critics had been saying all along, that she was talentless, that her success was luck, that she didn't deserve what she had. These aren't the questions of the woman the world thought it knew. They're the questions of a philosopher, a person engaged in serious self-examination, wrestling with ideas that have occupied thinkers for centuries. And she was writing them alone, at night, in notebooks no one was ever supposed to read. The 400 books, the night classes at UCLA, the informal tutorials with Carl Sandburg, the poems written at 2 a.m. on hotel stationery, the desperate question asked of Norman Rosten in a whisper over the phone, the view from the Brooklyn Bridge that kept her alive for one more day, all of it adds up to a portrait of someone profoundly different from the woman on the movie posters. Hollywood answered no. The studio system answered no. Even the men who claimed to love her answered no. But the fragments answered differently. They say, yes, you mattered. Your thoughts mattered. She asked Norman Rosten, is there poetry in there? The answer, 50 years later, is clear. There was always poetry in Marilyn Monroe. The tragedy is that she never got to hear us say it. Which revelation surprised you most? Her 400 books, her poetry, her childhood of disappearance, her devotion to the method, or her meditation on the Brooklyn Bridge? Drop a comment and let us know. Tell us which golden age Hollywood star we should explore next. We read every single suggestion. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who cherishes classic Hollywood. Every legend was a person first, and every person deserves to be seen for everything they were.